Welcome to L&D Disrupt, the podcast dedicated to helping you overcome workplace challenges and prepare for the future of work today. I'm your host, Nelson Sivalingam, and I'll be speaking with the movers, shakers, and path breakers in L&D who are reshaping their organizations right now. Join us each week as we delve into the highs and lows of work in the industry to get to the real nitty-gritty stuff that you actually care about.
I'm pleased to say on this week's episode of L&D Disrupt Live, we are talking about how to build a learning ecosystem and some of the reasons why it's never been more important. Thankfully, our guest, Katja Schipperheijn, quite literally wrote the book on learning ecosystems and is the founder of Habit of Improvement. If you're watching this, you'll see Katja showing the book on the screen. And also joined, as usual, by Nelson Sivalingam, HowNow CEO and author of Learning at Speed, which if anyone's read it will know there's some great content in there about learning ecosystems. And if you haven't read it, I would recommend checking it out. I think the logical starting point is to define what a learning ecosystem is, to really understand what that entails before we dive into the specifics of it. Now, Nelson, I know you have a really cool definition of a learning ecosystem, so maybe you can explain that to us and then we'll bring in Katja to elaborate.
Yeah, sure. I guess taking it back to, back in the days, all the knowledge that we had, probably all the recorded knowledge that we had lived in, one library of Alexandria in Egypt. But today, the kind of volume and level of knowledge and expertise we have doesn't fit in this one place, and it's scattered across so many different places. And what your learning ecosystem is essentially a network of the expertise, the knowledge, the skills, the tools, both inside and outside of your organization that brings all of this together. And, whether you know it or you don't, every organization, team, and individual exists within a learning ecosystem. And I guess becoming aware of that means you can now start to deliberately use this to get the maximum outcome out of it. And also, much like I'm sure anyone who's studied biodiversity at school and ecosystems back at school, you'll know, ecosystems that are more diverse and more interconnected and interdependent are the ones that are often more stable, more resilient. And that's also true for learning ecosystems. So there's a lot we can learn from the environment and biology and working on essentially building a more diverse and interconnected network of skills, expertise, and knowledge to build a more resilient learning ecosystem that can support the organization.
Yeah. And Katja, would you add anything to sort of Nelson's?
Well, I would like to add that for me, a learning ecosystem is everything that Nelson just said, but it's also in finding knowledge. And knowledge is much more than, for example, data, because today we also have to think about the knowledge and intelligence, which is artificial, and how it connects with us as humans. So for me, this learning ecosystem is also, like I call the symbiosis, using the best of innovation and of people. Also looking at how it works in nature. An ecosystem grows organically. And I think this is a little bit the same as what we see now in organizations. We have a lot of tools, we have a lot of knowledge, we have a lot of data, and it is actually finding our way to connect all those elements and create also a culture which is good for growing peoples and organizations. So I like the idea of technology, humans, and nature in the ecosystem.
Cool. To jump ahead a little bit to something we were maybe going to discuss later, but it seems like a natural place. Ecosystems tend to evolve and grow over time, like both of you have mentioned there. And I think that's definitely true within the workplace and workplace learning. So what are kind of the benefits of building an ecosystem that can grow with us over time? What are some of the ways people will see that as they do build an ecosystem that's kind of built to scale with them and fit with the culture?
Well, to build a learning ecosystem is not that easy because the elements are already in place. It is more how can you grow or better use the ecosystem that is already in place? How can you connect human to human or interest to interest, people to share knowledge? How can you make sure that people learn when they need to learn to apply it in their work, in their life? So building a learning ecosystem is like an architect of nature. You have to understand the elements to know how you can nurture them, that they actually grow themselves. I know it's a little bit weird that I say it, but it is what is happening within organizations. You cannot build a learning ecosystem from scratch. If you decide that your strategy will be, we are going to build a learning ecosystem tomorrow, then you're in for a very big challenge, I think.
Nelson, it comes back a little bit to something you mentioned, which is that we all have a learning ecosystem to some extent, or we're all existing in one already. So that kind of links to what Katja said there, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, we often ask the question of, if you think back to the last time you learned something that had a big impact on your performance or career, take a moment to think about that. The chances are it probably wasn't an e-learning course, right? It could have been learning from a colleague. It could have been reading a blog. It could have been listening to a podcast. It could have been tuning into a webinar. There's a whole range of things that could have had that impact on your performance and career. And so we are already interacting and engaging with our learning ecosystem that's there. But the challenge is more that there's a lot of friction in that process, right? It could be something as simple as, how do I find the most relevant bit of knowledge in my ecosystem? Or how does, what we were talking about earlier, how do you synthesize this into something that is meaningful for me in this moment in time? All of that process has a lot of friction baked into it right now, and especially if you're not working on your learning ecosystem. So as challenging as it is to build a learning ecosystem from scratch, the great thing is many of us don't have to. I think many organizations and teams already have existing tech stacks, content sources, inside, outside experts. It's really now looking at, where are those points of failure or friction points in that experience? And I think that's where the role of L&D significantly shifts. It's not about building the ecosystem, but it's taking the friction out of the ecosystem so we can get more value out of it.
Yeah, this speaks. Sorry, Katja.
Yeah, I like to add there that in my book, I call this lean learning. The friction, what you call friction, I call waste. Waste can be time, but waste can also be not using all the knowledge which is already available in the ecosystem. And this I see with knowledge of more senior employees. They have a lot of knowledge, but they don't share it with the people because they don't know it. Also, young people, they bring in other experiences, competences. And this is all waste if we can't use all their experience together. So what you say, indeed, friction, it's what we discussed last time. It's all about making learning lean. Knowledge sharing is lean.
Yeah. And there's different reasons this happens. I know, just to touch on a couple ones, one is enabling people with the culture and tools to be able to share knowledge. This, taking knowledge sharing as an example. If you have a culture where you don't have the psychological safety for someone to be able to openly share, or they feel like they have to hoard their knowledge and keep it to themselves because that's where their value comes from, then you're not going to be able to enable that. And sometimes it's the tools, right? There isn't a single place where we can capture and share all of this knowledge. And that creates the kind of friction for you to be able to do that. And so there are many different reasons why that behavior might not exist and you could be losing out. And we've spoken about this in the show before, where if you've not enabled something like knowledge sharing and you're not tapping into your internal experts, you have what we call the leaky bucket problem, right? Which is every time someone leaves the organization, all of that good stuff that's in their brain leaves with them. And essentially you're back at the point where you're having to relearn the things that you once knew, and no company can afford to be in that situation today.
Yeah, I want to add a small thing to it. You're talking about all the intelligence knowledge in the company, but before that you said the ecosystem is also your partners around the company. And when I'm thinking of this, I'm thinking of the gig economy, the platform economy. A lot of young people, they want to work on different projects at the same time. So also having their knowledge, finding their way to your organization and having them learning from your organization is helping all the organizations in the ecosystem to grow again. So you really have to start looking at it without boundaries.
Yeah. Yeah.
Katja, to maybe get your thoughts on something Nelson alluded to there, it's that it is the experts outside your company, and it means a kind of change in role for L&D teams a lot of the time. L&D teams probably, simply cannot create all of the content that people need to learn, and therefore we need to do more of that curation and more of centralizing things into one place. So I'd love to know a little bit about your thoughts on that.
Well, I'm going to be very honest. Learning for me is much more about content created or curated by L&D. Learning happens informal, by doing, by failing. And I think L&D only holds a very small part in today's learning ecosystems. Everybody is responsible for learning. It's actually starting with the individual. Am I open to learn? And as long as we think that L&D has the mandate to curate learning, I'm not feeling quite happy with it. Think about children again, how children learn. When I ask children, how do you prefer to learn, at school or at TikTok? They will say at TikTok. Children are reading books again because of TikTok. So they're bringing their own learnings and expertises to these open platforms, even like Roblox, and they learn from each other. Nobody is creating that content. Maybe some algorithms making sure that the content is distributed to those who can benefit from it. It's using technology, not L&D people. So...
Yeah, funny enough, you said that, Katja. It reminded me, I saw a book at the airport the other day that said like the TikTok sensation. It had a stick on it rather than like Richard and Judy's book club or #1 bestseller. It said TikTok sensation. So, but no, yeah, Nelson, to that point, maybe worth diving into a bit more. But it's about L&D teams as facilitators. That also means giving people the tools, giving people the guidelines to help build the ecosystem. Because, like Katja said, not one single person is responsible for it. Maybe the L&D team sets up the parameters, but we're all kind of responsible for what lives in the ecosystem, right?
Yeah, I think it's kind of a mindset shift to think about L&D as not as a single role, right? It's not a function. It's an organizational capability, right? And it's everyone's responsibility. Everyone in the company is responsible for L&D. And I think gone are those days of it's only the L&D person who's responsible for creating everything, pushing everything out, tracking whether it's working. And if people are complaining about learning, then it's L&D's fault. Those days are well and truly gone. I think what we need to think about now is how can the L&D function and the L&D team help the organization build this capability of learning and development. And so they become enablers. And that's what we should be striving for, is how do we enable learning to happen in the organization? And it's just, practically speaking, not possible for a small L&D team to be able to meet the needs of every single employee and team in the organization, right? Like to have to create for every need or to curate for it. It's not possible. And we've seen this. And that's why, if it wasn't happening, we wouldn't have, 70% of companies last year reporting saying they lost some of their talent due to a lack of growth opportunities. And if you work backwards, growth starts with building the skills you need to grow. And to build those skills, you need to engage in learning. And they're not engaging in learning because whatever they're getting isn't meaningful enough. And therefore, the organizational learning environment isn't supporting it. So for us to meet everyone's very individual needs and skills requirements, L&D need to play the role of building that capability. And that comes from nurturing this learning ecosystem, right tech stack, enabling the experts, bringing in the right resources, setting the guidelines for effective curation, right? You want your internal experts to also be curating, right? And the chances are, if I'm in the sales team and one of my colleagues in the sales team shared an article, I'm more likely to find it relevant and useful than something coming from, the L&D person who's done a search to go, what's useful for L&D people today? Or even better, they've asked ChatGPT. And so I think that's the kind of guidelines we need to bring in to be able to create that culture of learning and knowledge sharing.
There's 2 points I wanted to pick up on from that, but Katja, any thoughts on what Nelson just said before I dive into those?
Yeah, the role of L&D is changing so fast. And I'm not mentioning ChatGPT here yet because it's a little bit of a hype. But but I like what you say, they have to create this culture. In my book, I compare learning ecosystems with landscapes, from the idea of a landscape, a garden. And I call this new L&D professionals learnscapers. They create the environment, the culture, but they also are learning leaders themselves. They will tap into the knowledge. They break down the silos of the organization. They will sit together with the people from IT, with the people from the business, with the leadership, to all create this culture together. They're like, I don't want to call them the glue because the glue is fixed, but they are like this web, creating this web for a learning organization. And that's, for me, the new role. They have a lot of human skills as well, people from L&D, to connect all the stakeholders, to understand why people sometimes fear change, are afraid of learning, see learning as a tantalus torment, something that will never stop, because it's true. We will need to be learning all the time. We will never master anything anymore. The only thing that we need to master is the joy of learning. And for this, I think the L&D responsibles, they need to be there with every employee to make them understand that learning is actually something to help them and not something as a tick in the box, I did it. That's also why I'm always talking about the way that we measure the KPIs of learning, of our content. They're not working anymore in this environment. So we need to rethink everything what L&D is doing. And I think this is the moment to do it.
Yeah, I mean, that perfectly sets us up to talk about why now, which is one of the other questions we wanted to answer today. And to that point you just mentioned, Katja, about people being resistant to change. Nelson, in one of your talks recently, you shared this stat. I think it was like 70% of people would prefer not to face change, even if it brought a positive outcome. So yeah, I do really want to dive into this kind of why now issue. We're in this period of ever increasing change, ever increasing growth. It's all speeding up. Why is this the perfect moment, or like the fertile ground for ecosystems to be built and to grow and to flourish? Katja, you want to kick us off?
First of all, we all know that we need to learn to be able to be a digital citizen, to work. Not learning anymore is the same as dying almost. So 70 to 90% of all people globally know that they need to learn, but they don't know how, and they fear it. So again, this is for L&D the good opportunity to say, we can help you. Another very important reason why I think now is really the moment is I've been writing about learning and learning ecosystems since 2014. And my learning ecosystem then was talking about what technology could do, but it couldn't do it yet. It could make some adaptive learning paths maybe, but it was not possible. Today, with the speed of innovation, it is possible. We can connect all these technologies with each other. It's not that difficult anymore. And also, we know about speed of innovation. They say everything every 2 years, the doubling of the speed, but also the cost is going down very, very fast. So also the money of these nice innovations cannot be the obstacle anymore. So I think actually there is no reason anymore not to do it right now. Even more so, if you don't start embracing learning as one of these strategic choices of your organization, you're going to be left behind very, very fast.
Yeah, I'd build on that to say, especially right now, we're going through a very, very strange period of time where the skills shortage is hit a moment where it's now actually a sustained problem. I think post-COVID, there's conversations around, is this a temporary problem we're seeing in a shortage of talent? But what's really fascinating right now is in an economic downturn, typically what you see is the unemployment rates go up. Right, that's what you see. There's a recession, unemployment goes up, and right now, I mean, there's a lot of debate around: are we in a recession? Are we going to a recession? But what we can agree on is we're definitely in a tightening market, and we are seeing an economic downturn. However, we're seeing some of the lowest unemployment rates we've seen in the last 50 years, which doesn't happen. So what that tells us is essentially the demand for talent is higher than ever before. And so if in a down market, we're seeing such high demands for talent, then you can imagine once we go back into a bull market, how competitive it's going to be. So there's well and truly a skill shortage. There's a lot of talk with generative AI and AI around, AI and robots replacing jobs, etc. But actually, our biggest problem right now is there aren't enough skilled humans to take the jobs that we need people to do. There's an incredible statistic that came out of the US labor market, which said there are right now 6 open roles for every qualified person. So there's a lot of job opportunity out there. Meanwhile, what's happening is, like I mentioned earlier, companies are losing some of their best talent because of a lack of growth opportunities. So essentially what's happening is they're not helping them build the skills to grow. And there's so much job opportunity out there. People are confident enough to say, well, you know what, I'll keep looking until I find the company that's going to support our growth, right? So what that means for an organization is it's too expensive and competitive for you to hire that skill externally. And if you don't do anything about it internally, there's so much opportunity, people will leave. So the risk of you losing your best talent is higher than ever before. And so you have to do something about this. And so the companies that will win in this talent war are the companies that are able to help their people build skills in the shortest time. And to do that, we come back to the learning ecosystem. We need a shift where you can't, this traditional way of I'm going to build and create everything that everyone's going to learn in my company. It's just not going to enable you to be able to build those skills as fast as you need to. And so it's a necessity that you start to make your learning ecosystem work and you change the way you approach L&D in your organization. Otherwise, what you'll have is people don't feel like they're building skills. And I just want to point out, often we associate growth with job promotion. But what we've seen in companies is companies are getting flatter, right? Especially post COVID, with the economic downturn, with the redundancies and layoffs that happen. Actually, where you've seen the biggest redundancies has been in the middle management layer. Right. So organizations have got flatter, which means you can't always give promotions based on job titles. People need to experience growth based on the skills that they're building and the mastery that they're building, rather than just looking at job titles.
Yeah. I want to add one little thing to this. Keeping talent is one thing. Attracting talent is another thing. Younger people, they did a lot of research on this. They want to work for purpose. We all know this. But if they can select a new employer, they will also look at who is having the best learning ecosystem. They actively look for an employer that helps them with learning. So if you want to use learning in your employer branding, I think that's a very good idea.
Yeah. And I think as well, some of this comes back to the logistics of building the ecosystem, right? So the ecosystem helps us create a central place for learning, which means that whether you're new to a role and you need to find something, or you're facing a problem, you can find it in one place. You're having the ecosystem gives you a place to capture knowledge. And therefore, if we are facing a skill shortage or the risk of losing talent is high, we start building that habit of capturing knowledge so that other people can find it and apply it. So before we move on to sort of a slightly different question, I wondered if you have any thoughts on those logistical parts of the ecosystem.
I want to add there that when I talk with my customers and when we do workshops, what we see is one of the major problems that they have is the onboarding part, managing the expectations. And I think we focus a lot on learning paths, but we don't do enough on pre-boarding. So learning is actually starting before people are joining our organization. They need to learn about the vision of the company, about the strategy, about work environment, colleagues, whatever. If you can manage to bring learning to a pre-boarding phase, you can see that you hire those talents that will perform in your ecosystem. Also, what I see with a lot of companies is that they say young people, they tend to leave after 6 months, after a year. People don't stay anymore. But if you can manage expectations, then you see that people stay longer within your company.
Yeah. And I think a key part to what you were saying as well, Gary, is that tech infrastructure. And this is where we need to be very candid here. The LMS is just not doing it, right? It wasn't built for this. And I think it's unfair to blame the LMS because you're asking it to do things it was never intended for, right? It was essentially built in a world which was very content-led, right? It was very e-learning or classroom training-led. It wasn't about the ecosystem life, right? It was about, I need a tool that's going to allow me to author some courses and store it in one place and then see whether people completed the content or not. It's not there to tell you whether it had real meaningful impact. It's not there to bring your ecosystem together. It's not there to personalize the learning based on the skills you're trying to build. But what you're seeing now is these big companies who've built large LMS companies who realize actually this old thing we've built is not fit for purpose today, but actually takes a long time to turn a ship, right? So they can't overnight do anything. So they have to carry on selling that LMS to you. And this is where you need to ask the question of what is the problem you're trying to solve, right? And whether is this the right tech stack for you to solve that problem? And, the problem you're trying to solve is closing the skills gap in your organization or supporting the career development of people and building that learning ecosystem. Then you really need to ask yourself the LMS. I think people know this, and that's why we often find in organizations where we're about to start working with them, they're hacking together solutions, right? They're using Slack to share knowledge. They're using other types of tools that weren't intended in that way. I mean, we were talking to a frontline workforce where they were using WhatsApp to share knowledge, but not going to the LMS, although they had one. And it's got to a point where people think, I need an LMS. Once I'm a certain size, the tech I need is called an LMS, right? And it's almost like the old school way of you graduate, you think you need to get a stable job, then you need to settle down with a family and buy a house. And, someone wrote the stages of life for you and you're just going through the motions. That's exactly what we're doing with organizational L&D. We're like, well, we're above a certain size, we need an LMS. But really ask that question, what's the problem that you need this to solve? And is this the right tech to do that for you?
You will find in my book that there is an whole chapter indeed on problems are actually opportunities if we understand what the problem is, because we only see the tip of the iceberg of the problem. And when we do why questions, why is this a problem, we will see that there are actually many other opportunities linked to solve this problem. And this is the continuous improvement that we need to do when we're building a learning ecosystem. This is how it works. Drill down in where can we improve. And LMS systems, for me, many of those are content management systems, and it's okay to have them. Every piece in the ecosystem has their value. It depends what you want to do. If you can connect all the pieces, and I like to create learner personas, from marketing. I reflect also a lot to marketing, where I know that I can reach my grandmother still on Facebook, my eldest daughter on Snapchat, and my youngest on Instagram. Then this is the same. Maybe for some employees, the content, even the e-learning on your LMS system is still okay. But when we think about retail, for example, and we think about young employees that are helping with hospitality, maybe a micro-learning gamified platform is much better for them. But think again on engineers. They need to come together maybe. So this is, for me, the importance of an ecosystem as well. And coming back to the urgency, today we can connect all these tools. We can create these learner personas and build this environment where everybody can connect, lean to the knowledge that they need.
Yeah, I just want to remind people before we pick up on a couple of points there that we're about halfway through. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. Nelson, you also teed me up perfectly to drop in a link to send people to a weekly walkthrough we now do of HowNow. So if you want to see how our LXP can help you build a learning ecosystem, how you can kind of unpick some of the problems Nelson talked about with an LMS, I'll pop the link in the chat there. And if you're listening to the recording, that will also be in the description. And a reminder that at the top of the chat and also in the description will be a link to the Death of the LMS guide, which also builds on some of the problems Nelson spoke about there. I do want to dive into this kind of tangible thing of building the ecosystem and come back to something you mentioned, Katja, which was tools that speak to each other. So essentially, I guess something you mentioned to me before is that if we're bringing together the right tools, it gives us a bigger picture of how L&D is involved, the impact it has. I also want to kind of get your thoughts on that and how we work out which tools build the ecosystem, right? Like to Nelson and your point, some tools are no longer fit for purpose because they don't solve a problem. So I know there's a lot to unpack there, and I've asked you a big, long question, but we'd love to know your thoughts.
This is a really good question and also a very difficult question, because in the learning ecosystem, you just said, Nelson, what's up? What's up? To communicate something can be good. Think again, when we were all in lockdown in the logistics sector, there were still deliveries. Well, still, there were much more deliveries, but the rules for the drivers change day by day. So they need to relearn every day what they had to do. So thinking again, the problem was, how can we relearn them every day? The opportunity was, we can connect with them. We can actually engage them in the new strategies. So I saw some organizations using, for example, micro-learning platforms or LXPs with a function to communicate direct to groups. Think again about the learner personas. They knew that those drivers were not allowed to take the phone while driving, so they could even manage that they could get the message at the end of their day, which is different for every driver. So they created this environment, and what they saw afterwards is that they had found a way to engage with those drivers or blue-collar employees that they normally didn't have a connection with. And they saw that also the people using these tools were more engaged. So this is just one idea. But I see other organizations that are creating intranet solutions, which is not normally something that we see as a learning tool. Communities. It depends. And that's what I say. If they ask me, we want to create a learning ecosystem, what are the tools that we need? I would go in and I would do a workshop with them. And what is it actually that you want to achieve? What are your objectives? Once you got the objectives right, then you can look at the opportunities. When you know all the opportunities, then you know that they're linked to each other. I give you an idea. When some organizations ask me, we need a new LMS system that is adaptive to the employees, then I will ask them, do you have all the data on your employees? Do you know what they need? Because you can buy the coolest, most expensive, data-driven LMS system. But if you don't have the data, if HR has no idea what the people want, where they want to go, then you can't use the system. So then you first need to do something about gathering the data, understanding the people that you want to hire, understanding the learning paths. So when we do this, what are the opportunities for growth of the learning ecosystem? You need to prioritize. And you will see, and again, this is the Kaizen idea, like in nature, that if you start building here this little seed, it grows from there. You see that I use a lot of the Fibonacci spiral always. Think a little bit about a sunflower, how you create all these opportunities together that strengthen each other. So for me, it's not so much about what tools do we need, because I will say in my book, even if you start talking to me about tools in our first conversation, I will ask you, did you, and I'm sorry to tell you, did you spoke to a salesperson? Because I first need to know your objectives, and then we can talk about tools. That's only the third step in the process for improvement. So yeah. I'm sorry, I'm not going to tell you which tools you need, because some people might copy paste and it will not be relevant for their organization.
I'd probably also say I'd break it down into 3 layers, right? So to see what the structure of this ecosystem could look like. With say the top layer could be, let's just call it the learning layer. This is where you're integrating with your sources of knowledge, skills and experts. And often this, like I said earlier, can be inside the organization. So you might have knowledge that lives in internal systems, your Google Drive, your SharePoint, third-party content libraries that you have licenses for, Slack, Teams, all of these places are sources of valuable knowledge that an employee might need. And you can connect with all of these in different ways, SFTP integrations, APIs, etc. And then you've got external content sources, which could be bringing external experts, running your live sessions, all the way to, again, API integrations or RSS feeds to blogs, podcasts. But that top layer is essentially bringing all of those sources of expertise, knowledge, and skill in. Then the second layer is let's call it the data layer, right? The data layer is what personalizes and contextualizes it for your organization, for your team, for your individual. And that data layer, to enrich it, you need to integrate it with data sources, right? So it could be your HR system as the bare minimum, where you're able to pull in talent data around, what's this person's job role, what was their previous work history, any of that data you might have in your HR system. You might also integrate with a performance management system that you have that tells you what are the development areas for this particular person. The reality is you have a lot of data connectors in your organization already. And so this is not something you need to necessarily look outwards for. You just need something that's going to allow you to connect with the data sources in your organization and bring that together into a data layer. And the final one is, let's call it the discovery layer, right? This is where I've brought this ecosystem together. I'm using the data to be able to say what is relevant for this individual, this team, this organization. Now I need to deliver it and make it discoverable. And this is where we would recommend embedding it in the flow of work, right? What we've done is we drag the employee into the LMS. But let's face it, other than L&D people, no one really spends time in the LMS unless they're mandated to do so. And actually what they do instead is they spend 80% of their time in tools like Slack, Teams, Salesforce, HubSpot, Intercom, WhatsApp, or whatever tools they're using on a day-to-day basis, Instagram, TikTok, all of these tools are where they're spending most of their time. And so instead of dragging the employee into the LMS, what we need to do is take the learning into the flow of work and embed it there. And so what you need to think about there is that access discovery layer and making sure you can embed it in existing habits. And so I'd say they're the three layers to think about. It's how you do that and also what goes into each of those layers in the ecosystem.
Yeah, Katja, to pick up on Nelson's last point there about not always needing to look outward or, like you said earlier, a particular solution. Part of this is to look at what people are already doing, where they already learn, and how you bring that into the learning ecosystem. So like Nelson said earlier, people be looking at maybe what their colleagues share on something like LinkedIn or like Slack. I think I just wanted to hear your thoughts on the importance of that understanding of where people are already learning and bringing that together, as opposed to, like Nelson said, trying to force something on people.
Well, that's what we talk about with the learner personas. It's very easy to create, for example, for your leaders, where are they? And maybe you have to create in the beginning just some learner personas. Like, for example, we want our leaders to be there. We want our people in retail to be there. And then it is easy because then you understand it. This is what marketing is doing, because what is marketing actually doing? They understand that, for example, if they want to change the behavior of somebody to buy this shampoo and next month this shampoo, they also use the neuroscience and link this to the personas and then actually create paths to reach those people in the moment where they can convince them to change their behavior to buy another shampoo. Learning is no different than what we know from marketing. You see, by the way, that in a lot of L&D organizations, they're actually looking for people from the marketing teams to join the forces. Again, one of the silos going down. I was just telling it. We need to work together. L&D can learn so much from marketing and the other way around. So this is one thing. We really need to understand where we can engage, also for what purpose. You said in the learning in the workflow, learning in the moment of need. 5 moments of need. It is very simple. If you want to learn something for the first time, you might need to take a couple of hours for that. But when you want to change a behavior in an urgency, you need to reach that person immediately. Because otherwise there is a risk that he's doing something to injure himself or to have problems with the organization. So learner personas, and link this to the moment of need that they need to learn. And then you can create these learning paths. And that is something that it takes a little bit more time, and is much harder to measure than the success of the content on your learning management system. The only thing, and you not so much just saying it's about performance management. I've seen organizations linking their performance management tools to their learning tools. And indeed, they could see, for example, think about salespeople. He's really bad in closing the job. We see that in the spider diagram of a sales performance tool, that he needs extra learning. So we can then immediately link this to the learning tool used by the salesperson to give him more info, or even to link him with the best closer of the organization to join forces. So you see, you can create all these new learning paths. And it seems difficult, but again, look at the problems that you encounter now in your organization where you see that you need more learning opportunities or engagement opportunities. Look at how you can turn these problems from root cause to opportunities and start building from there. What are the quick win tools or even new ways of work? Because it's not always related to tools or technology. Sometimes it can be a change of a process that you follow. And then it's easy. You have these small quick wins. And also those who are not so happy to change, those stakeholders, they will see that sometimes a little change is easy to take. And you work from there. And then also, it's easier for us to implement the learning ecosystem if we do it with these small steps.
Yeah, Nelson, I wanted to
I was just going to say. Go on,
Kat. No, I was going to say the way that Katja described the marketing teams trying to change behavior, L&D teams are trying to influence performance in those moments, right? And just to add another layer to the question, the way, if we build an ecosystem where the tools are talking to each other, it also help us define problems, right? To Katja's example there, if there's a sales tool that has data on how a sales team is performing, if it's part of the ecosystem, it can help us define the problems better, right?
Yeah, actually, I mean, right now, most L&D teams, when we start working with them, they essentially have incomplete data, right? If the only data source you're looking at is your, say, traditional LMS that holds some of your classroom training and e-learning, that's not a complete view of all of the learning and development that individual is doing. And so you essentially need to be aware you're making decisions, not informed. You're making decisions on very incomplete, quite fragmented data. And you've got to be aware that carries a lot of risk in that. And so I think it's looking at when you bring this ecosystem together and you use, for example, the right type of learning experience platform that can help you bring all of that data together, you now have a complete view, right? Because otherwise what you'd be doing is neglecting informal learning, say, for example, which is often what happens in organizations. Although it's what people probably spend most of their time doing is the informal learning. It's the part that gets neglected the most because it's not being tracked and measured, and you can't tie it back to your narrative that you're trying to build in the organization. And so you leave it out. And so it doesn't actually tell the complete story around how things are going. And I think going back to the earlier point around change, I think it's such a fascinating point because in the world of L&D, we're in the business of change. That's what we do in L&D, right? We're all about driving change and managing change. That's what we do. Yet we are also victims of being quite reluctant to change. Everyone is. No one really likes change. Even the people who say they like change are lying to you, right? But there is one thing that drives people to change, even when they're reluctant to change, and that's a very big change. Right? When something big, undeniable, so significant and relevant changes, that makes the current status quo unacceptable. And when the current status quo becomes unacceptable, you now realize if I don't change, I'm going to be at the risk of a potential threat, or there's an opportunity I'm going to miss.
You know what? It's not this black swan only that you're talking about, the big change. Did you ever look at children? They don't understand our world. We as L&D people, we look at what we know, but we should actually talk to children. because they are already living in a different world. In 5 to 8 years, they will apply with your companies and they will think that they go back to prehistorical times. So it's not only this big change. The big change happened. It's called children. So,
Katja, I know you maybe give people some context. I know you've worked through a few of your endeavors with lots of children and they've taught you some very specific lessons about how we learn. So yeah, maybe give us that little bit of context about what some of those kind of ventures were and the big takeaways you took from children that you worked with.
Yeah, so besides indeed my work with multinationals, corporations, startups, I'm also running a non-for-profit organization working with children around the globe to help them understand the virtual world. Through these children, we hope to reach teachers and parents to have this gap that is living between them. This comes actually from the idea that 10 years ago, my eldest daughter one day came home. She was 9 at the time, saying, "Mom, I need to go on Facebook." And I was like, "No, you can't." She said, "Mom, you're so old." And she was yelling at me, but she was right. She said, "Mom, you don't understand our world. All my friends are connected all the time. Mama, they share stuff, maybe about me. And Mom, they're doing their homework together. So if their grades will be better than mine, that's your fault. What are you going to do about it?" So that was the time that I was doing my research for a PhD on ecosystems, on learning ecosystems. And I was like, oh my God, I'm looking to the future. I don't have to investigate what we can do now. We have to see what these children do. So this is what I keep doing. I've seen 15,000 children around the globe from very different backgrounds, but they're all connected. Even in some countries that you wouldn't believe, they all have a smartphone or a digital tool, and it's not yet like an implant in their head, as what Neuralink is trying to do, but apparently they can do now testing on human beings, so very curious to see where that is going, but they have it already in their hand. They're connected all the time. They do lean learning. They don't need to know when there was this special date in history. They ask Siri or a friend, or even in Snapchat, their virtual friend knows that they're talking about something which is now linked to ChatGPT, and they're interfering in these conversations with children. They have a virtual friend that they're asking questions to all the time. Am I very happy with that? That's another story. But that's the future. And we are still thinking and talking about our LMS system. So yeah, that's my thing with children.
And I just want to know, when your kid is ready for a sales job, can you send them our way? Because we often talk to L&D professionals about how to build a business case and talk about the cost of inaction. And I love the fact that your kid said, if I get bad grades, it's your fault.
It's great marketing as well. Nelson has tapped into an emotional message there. So cool. We're coming up to the last 10 minutes. I can't believe how quickly this conversation's flown by, but there's two things I really did want to tap into. Katja, one is about an understanding of where we are now. I think you discussed this in the book a little bit, but how can people kind of get an idea, coming back to this point earlier, like Nelson said, we have these tools, maybe we have incomplete data. What would be the way for us to get an understanding of where we are at this moment in time with our ecosystem?
I was just saying that I was doing my research already so many years ago. And I had this idea of a learning maturity model where organizations would grow through. And my first level was a data repository organization. A lot of data locked into systems or in humans. No free flow of knowledge. Then we had other organizations that were, even at the time, communicating a lot. And communication is good. It's part from learning, but they couldn't measure the effect. Then you have those companies that are already collaborating with each other. But collaboration is also not learning. So you see 5 different levels. And most organizations, even today, are 90% data repository. A lot of dead knowledge in silos from IT. For example, an HRM system owned by those people. You can't access it. If you want to grow your business, the more tools that you can connect to make sure that you have a lean learning, free flow of knowledge, lean performance management, this is connecting all the tools and the people to each other, then you grow. That's the growing of the ecosystem. But again, where are we now? Not much further than 10 years ago when I started my research. So the sense of urgency, these children are going to apply for a job in your company. They're used to their virtual friend on Snapchat. So we have to change because you will not attract those children.
Nelson, just to build on what Katja said there about most companies maybe at the moment being kind of a data repository or like a knowledge kind of system, how would you have any advice for people understanding the current state of their own ecosystem and what needs to be done next?
Yeah, I actually think it starts with a mindset shift, because I think when we speak to L&D professionals, and one of the biggest concerns they have is, I'm not too sure if my people are ready for this. And that's always makes me chuckle, because actually, like how we're talking about Snapchat's, virtual friend, the technology we use as a consumer is so far more advanced than what we're actually using within the workplace. And so what we're starting to see, especially with hybrid working, is there's an acceleration in what you call the consumerization of work, right? Where our expectations of work is also similar to what we expect as a consumer. And when there's a disconnect, we now disengage, right? Well, why would I use this tool when actually there's a far easier way of doing it that I use as a consumer? And those lines are really starting to blur now, especially accelerated by hybrid working and remote working. And so actually the answer to that question, are my people ready for this? Yes, they are, right? It's actually, we're holding them back and we're not moving fast enough. And it's actually what we need to be self-aware about. It's our own fear of change. And going back to why do we fear this, is because change inherently carries risk, right? For some people, it carries personal risk, right? What if it looks bad on me? I bring this change in, I bring this tool in, and actually it doesn't land. It might carry financial risk. Oh, this is so much of my budget. What if it doesn't work? Social risk, the stigma of no one wants to be the person who bought in a platform no one uses, right? So there's so much risk that's inherent in any kind of change project, which means we're reluctant to that change. And so, there's the fear of messing up. And that question comes from a fear of messing up. What if my people aren't ready for it, and therefore I launch this and actually they don't engage with it and they don't get any value? And I think it's being aware of that and thinking through that to go, okay, so how do we address that? Right? How do we check if our people are ready for you? I mean, it's quite simple. Just ask them. Right? We can very quickly find out, are people ready for this? How do they feel about the current status quo? And what are they asking to change? And so I think it's that mindset shift. And another fundamental mindset shift is going towards an outcome focused mindset rather than an output focused mindset, right? It's not about, do I have the largest content library in the world? Have I managed to create the most number of courses in the shortest period of time? So I can show that I'm such a hard worker. It's not about that, because the reality is the business doesn't care. The business doesn't care how many courses you publish. The employees don't care how many courses you published and how many courses they got through. However, something like skills is a common language the business understands, right? The business understands skills. They understand skills they don't have and skills they need to build. The employee understands skills because they understand skills they need to develop and skills that they've gained. And you understand skills because that's you having impact on the business. So I think it's changing the language we use to talk about this and extending that to kind of change the mindset to focus on, are we delivering real meaningful impact? And that requires us to be outcome focused rather than output focused.
Yeah, Katja, I saw you nodding with a lot of what Nelson said there. So any sort of thoughts on that?
Well, it is indeed, we focus sometimes on the wrong things. I have a very big chapter on measuring success of the learning ecosystem. And I'm saying all the right things. It doesn't matter how much content that you have. If the content is not being shared, if it's not being used, that's again, it's not lean. Talking again about the waste, there is so much waste. L&D is still doing what they were doing 20 years ago. And even then it was outdated. I'm sorry to say it like this, but it is. So I see a lot of innovations fail because the objectives are just not managed. Why are we doing this?
Yeah, no, exactly. We're at the final couple of minutes now, Katja, but it'd be great if you could tell people just a little bit more about the book, because we'll put a link to it in the description and the show notes. But I'd love people to hear in your own words what they can gain from the book.
Well, first of all, I'm very proud to say that last week, my book became finalist in the Best International Business Book category in London. I'm still very surprised about that. But I think it is because it is talking about this urgency to see learning as a strategic choice for organizations to grow, to create these nimble strategies on how we can use data, how we can use innovation, how we can be more human, because it's also talking about what competences make us human, referring to all the work that I do with children. What can we also learn from children? We need to be more curious, open. We have to imagine the future. A lot about this. If we can imagine the future, then we can start changing. And it's all about this future thinking. So it's a book. It's not only written for L&D. It's also written for every executive that wants to grow from innovation with their people. So I think that's maybe also the reason for the success of the book, because it's not only L&D. It's actually more like a manifest to throw down these walls between all the silos of marketing and L&D and IT, and to work as one big connected brain.
Like you said earlier, Katja, everyone is responsible for the ecosystem, so it would make complete sense that it's spreading far and wide beyond just L&D. Katja, thank you so much. I really enjoyed that conversation. There's a lot of that sentiment being echoed in the chat. So really appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Nelson. And thank you everyone for joining us. As always, if you go to lu.ma/HowNow, you'll see all of the upcoming episodes, and hopefully we'll get to see you again soon. Before you head off, I want to tell you about two very exciting things. Death of the LMS, your free guide to Skills First L&D, is now live. From the numbers that explain L&D's current problems to lessons on how you can build a skills-led strategy, this is going to help you drive more impact through learning. You'll find the link right at the top of this episode's description. And just below that, a link to our new weekly walkthrough, where we show you how this can be done in practice and give you a tour of HowNow, our learning experience platform that gets 5 times more engagement than a traditional LMS. So, thanks for listening, and we look forward to seeing you again for another episode of the podcast.